"What's the matter, old man? Run out a fight already?" The punk sneered as he knocked Frank's cap off his head, letting it fall to the floor like it meant nothing. Frank didn't flinch. He just stared down at his coffee, hands steady, heart heavier than anyone could see. The gang of punks laughed louder, fists tightening, ready for one final shove, until a chair scraped back near the counter. Slow, heavy. Sylvester Stallone stood up. The coffee shop froze. What happened next left every single customer stunned in their seat. Welcome to Stallone Unleashed. Let's uncover what really happened. The morning sunlight filtered through the windows, casting soft, golden beams over the worn wooden tables of the small coffee shop. The air was thick with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, mingling with the faint scent of baked pastries. A soft hum of conversation filled the room, punctuated by the occasional clink of ceramic mugs and the hiss of steam from the espresso machine. It was an ordinary morning in an ordinary neighborhood, where nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. At a corner table near the window, a man sat alone. His uniform, though neatly pressed, betrayed the years of service it had witnessed, faded creases and a few stubborn stains. The edges of his cap were frayed, but it sat proudly atop his head, a symbol of battles fought, sacrifices made. His name was Frank, and though his body bore the scars of war, his demeanor was calm, almost serene. He didn't need to speak to command respect. His presence alone was enough. He stirred his coffee slowly, his mind elsewhere, lost in the rhythms of memory. Frank had been coming to this coffee shop for months, always at the same time, sitting at the same table, with the same quiet routine. The morning bustle around him didn't faze him. It never did. It was his way of coping, his way of finding peace in a world that no longer felt familiar. Today, however, there was something different in the air. The usual chatter was louder, more restless. Frank took no notice at first, lost in thought as he sipped his coffee. The door opened, and a small group of young men entered, laughing loudly, their voices sharp and brash. They moved to a table near the counter, and for a moment, their presence was nothing more than background noise. But it wasn't long before their attention turned to Frank. The taunts started softly at first, like whispers, but soon they were louder, more mocking, like the kind of cruelty only youth could possess. Frank remained still, his eyes fixed ahead, pretending not to hear. It wasn't the first time. Every morning, Frank followed the same routine. It wasn't about predictability, it was about control. The kind of control he'd once had in battle, the kind that made sense of the chaos. He woke at precisely 6 a.m., just as the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. He dressed slowly, methodically, each movement calculated, as though he were preparing for another mission. His military-issued jacket, though worn with age, still fit him perfectly, a reminder of a time when his body was stronger, faster. By 6:30, Frank was out the door. He walked with a steady, deliberate pace, the faintest limp noticeable in his right leg, a constant reminder of the explosion that had changed everything. He never took the bus or the car. Walking helped him clear his head. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour, and the world felt a little more peaceful in the early morning stillness. The coffee shop was only a few blocks away. When he arrived, he greeted the barista with a quiet nod, the same woman every morning. She didn't ask questions, and he didn't offer answers. He simply ordered his black coffee, no sugar, no cream, just the way he liked it. She handed him the cup, and he took his usual seat by the window. There, he would sit for an hour, watching the world go by, observing the lives of others. People came and went, but Frank remained, steady in his solitude. Some mornings, the shop was busier than others, but it never disturbed him. He preferred the solitude, the sense that he was part of something, even if it was just the passing of time. He would sip his coffee slowly, savoring the warmth, and let his thoughts drift. Sometimes, memories of his service would slip in, and other times, he'd let his mind wander to the simpler things, the things that helped him hold on to the life he now lived. It was always the same. Until today. Frank hadn't expected anything different today. The coffee shop was its usual self, familiar faces, the hum of early conversations, the quiet clink of cups and saucers. He was lost in the rhythm of his morning, the steady movement of his hand lifting the cup to his lips, the warmth spreading through him as he took his first sip. It was a comfort, a routine that helped him maintain some semblance of normalcy. But then, as the door opened with its familiar chime, Frank's eyes flicked toward the counter, where the barista was preparing someone's order. His gaze lingered on a man standing there. Something about him seemed different, though Frank couldn't quite place why. He looked familiar, but not in the way that he had been in the shop before. This man carried a presence, one that seemed to command the space around him without saying a word. The man stood with an air of confidence, his broad shoulders relaxed beneath a jacket, and a slight smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Frank watched as he ordered, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice that carried weight but wasn't loud. The barista smiled, handing over his drink with a friendly gesture, and the man turned to walk toward a table. It was when the man's eyes met Frank's that something clicked in his mind. A flash of recognition, but not the kind you get from a casual acquaintance. No, this was different. The man's eyes held a depth, something more than just the usual morning pleasantries. Frank wasn't sure how long they had been looking at each other, but in that brief moment, something unspoken passed between them. The man didn't approach, didn't make a big show of the encounter. He simply nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement, before turning toward the table in the corner. Frank's heart rate picked up slightly. There was something about him, something that made Frank feel like he wasn't just another face in the crowd. Something more. The air in the coffee shop seemed to shift as the young group at the counter grew louder. At first, it was just a few jokes tossed back and forth, harmless banter that went unnoticed by most. But then, one of the voices cut through the buzz, sharp and mocking, dragging the attention of others toward their table. Frank remained in his corner, his hands steady around his coffee cup, but his mind began to sharpen, focusing on the voices that were growing more brash. It started with a comment, a laugh at someone's expense. Frank didn't pay much attention at first, but soon, the insults grew clearer, sharper. He tried to block it out, to lose himself in the comfort of his routine, but the laughter became harder to ignore. One of the young men, who had been joking around with his friends, caught sight of Frank sitting at his usual spot. "Hey, look at this guy," the voice rang out, a little too loud for the peaceful atmosphere of the shop. "You see that? A veteran, right? Must have seen some stuff, huh? What do you do now? Sit here and drink your coffee, trying to forget it all." The group chuckled, but their laughter wasn't light. It was cutting, cruel. Frank's hand tightened around his cup, the warmth of the ceramic a stark contrast to the coldness he felt creeping in. He remained still, not reacting, his eyes steady on the surface of his coffee. The last thing he wanted was to draw attention to himself, to give them the satisfaction. But the taunting didn't stop. The young man stood up, swaggering toward Frank's table, the rest of the group egging him on. "What's it like?" he sneered, standing just a few feet away. "Must be nice to just sit there, all peaceful, like you did your part, right? But now what? You're just another old man waiting to die." Frank's eyes lifted slowly, meeting the young man's with a calm that only masked the storm inside. The coffee shop grew quieter as others began to take notice. The mocking wasn't a joke anymore. It was an attack, and Frank could feel the weight of it pressing in. The young man didn't back down. His words were sharp and relentless, his smug grin widening as he saw Frank's expression remain unchanged. He paced around the table now, as if the challenge had already been won, his friends snickering behind him. "I bet you don't even know what real fighting is, huh?" he mocked, throwing a quick glance at his buddies, encouraging them to join in. "You sit there, wearing your medals like they mean something. But what did you really do? What have you done lately?" Frank could feel the temperature of the room drop as the laughter spread, the group feeding off each other's energy, emboldened by the discomfort they had caused. The sound of their mockery felt hollow, echoing in his ears. He wasn't sure how much more he could take. His fingers tightened around the edge of his cup, the ceramic now feeling more like a weight than a comfort. But still, he didn't react. He had learned long ago that the best way to handle such cruelty was to stay silent, to let their words crash against him without giving them the satisfaction of a response. The young man was closing in, leaning over the table now, his voice dropping to a more personal tone. "What's it like, huh? Living off the government's handouts? You think you're some kind of hero?" His breath was hot and heavy as he spoke, every word dripping with disdain. Around them, the coffee shop was still, as if everyone had subconsciously held their breath, waiting for Frank to do something, to say something. But he remained seated, his gaze steady, his posture unmoving. The ridicule continued, now accompanied by exaggerated gestures and pointed looks, but Frank's silence only seemed to provoke them further. The group's laughter grew louder, the last shred of any decency in the room slipping away as they circled him. The young man's eyes narrowed, sensing victory. Frank could feel the pressure building, but he held his ground, knowing that this too would pass. But he couldn't shake the feeling that someone would intervene. Frank's eyes never wavered from the young man in front of him. The taunts came in waves now, each insult more personal, more cutting than the last. But Frank remained still, as if he were a stone in the middle of a raging river. His breath remained steady, his posture unbroken. Inside, however, the storm raged. His mind flashed to places he didn't want to go, to memories that were sharper than any words the young man could throw at him. But Frank had learned long ago how to bury those memories deep, how to lock them away. He knew that the moment he reacted, no matter how justifiable, it would be the moment they won. The young man, growing increasingly frustrated by Frank's unshakable calm, took another step forward. He slapped the table, the sound echoing through the shop. "You think you're better than me, huh?" he spat, leaning in even closer. "You're just an old man with a bunch of stories no one cares about anymore. Your time's up. It's over." A flash of heat coursed through Frank's veins, the words hitting their mark in a way that was impossible to ignore. For a moment, he could feel the old instinct stirring, a desire to stand, to fight, to show the young man just how wrong he was. But Frank didn't move. He didn't react. He had been through too much to be shaken by someone like him. Instead, Frank reached slowly for his coffee, taking a deliberate sip, his hand steady. He met the young man's eyes with the same unyielding calm, as if to say, "Your words don't matter." The coffee was warm, familiar, grounding him once again. The young man hesitated, unsure what to make of the silence. The crowd in the coffee shop had grown still, watching this quiet standoff unfold. The mockery had lost its bite in the face of Frank's resilience. The young man looked around, his bravado slipping away as he realized something that Frank had known all along. His strength wasn't in the noise he made or the insults he hurled. It was in his ability to remain unbroken, no matter how loud the world got. And Frank, despite everything, was still standing tall. The atmosphere in the coffee shop was thick with tension, the laughter and jeers from the young group slowly fading as Frank's stoic silence persisted. The other patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes darting from Frank to the young man, unsure of how to intervene or if they should. It was one of those moments when you felt like you should do something but didn't know how. Everyone felt the weight of the confrontation, but no one moved. Except for one person. From the corner of the room, a small smile began to form on the face of the man who had entered the coffee shop earlier, the one Frank had noticed when he first walked in. He had been sitting alone at a table near the back, his face hidden in the shadows, but now that same face was lit by the soft glow from a nearby overhead light. The man's eyes were sharp, focused not on the young group, but on Frank, studying him with a quiet intensity. It wasn't just a smile. It was knowing, as if the man understood exactly what Frank was doing. The patience, the resolve, the strength that came not from words, but from the way he carried himself. The young man at the table, still seething with frustration at Frank's calm, caught the stranger's glance. For a brief moment, his posture faltered, but then he shook it off, turning back to Frank with a renewed sneer. "What? Are you waiting for someone to save you?" He sneered, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Or is this just how you live now? Sitting in coffee shops, pretending like you're something special?" Frank's eyes briefly flicked to the man in the corner, who had yet to shift his gaze from him. There was a glimmer of something there, something Frank couldn't quite place. In that moment, Frank wasn't alone. He could feel it. The man in the corner wasn't just an observer. There was something quietly supportive in his expression, as if he, too, was waiting for the right moment to step in. But for now, he allowed Frank to handle it on his own. The young man didn't know it, but this battle had already been won. The young man's words echoed through the room, but Frank's focus had shifted. For a brief second, he allowed himself to glance back toward the corner of the coffee shop. The man was still there, unmoving, but his presence had an undeniable weight. His eyes, sharp and knowing, remained fixed on Frank, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Frank didn't feel so alone. There was something in that gaze, something reassuring, like a quiet promise that this moment, this mockery, would not go unanswered. The young man at the table was oblivious to the exchange. His voice grew louder, his insults more venomous as he sought the attention of the crowd. "What's the matter? Too scared to speak up?" he taunted, pacing back and forth in front of Frank. His friends laughed, egging him on, but the air between them had shifted. The energy was no longer playful or light. It was tense, charged with an undercurrent of something else, something deeper. The crowd, who had been uncertain moments before, was starting to feel the weight of the situation. But it was in that corner that something important was happening. The man's gaze never wavered. He had not moved since Frank first noticed him. It was as if he understood that the best way to handle this was not with noise or confrontation, but with quiet resolve. He was waiting for Frank to handle this in his own way. His presence, though still and silent, had a calming effect, like a steady hand in the midst of chaos. Frank, though tempted to speak, remained silent. His chest rose and fell slowly as he took another sip of his coffee, letting the warmth center him. He was no longer concerned with the mockery or the crowd. There was something about this moment that made him realize that the battle wasn't just his to fight. The man in the corner was watching, but he wasn't the only one. Frank's eyes shifted, taking in the room once more. It seemed like everyone had begun to notice the weight of what was happening, the struggle between respect and arrogance playing out in the silence. The mockery had turned from entertainment to something far more serious. The young man's frustration was palpable, his previous bravado beginning to falter under the weight of Frank's silence. But instead of backing off, he pushed harder, his voice growing louder, more desperate for attention. "What's the matter, old man? Did the war break you? Is that it?" The words were sharp, cruel, meant to hurt, and they landed with a sting. "You're just a ghost in this place, aren't you? A relic stuck in the past. Nobody cares about you anymore." Frank's eyes remained steady, unflinching, but the words were cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. He had learned long ago to wear his wounds like armor, to hide the scars that weren't just physical. But something about this man's taunting, the way he seemed to revel in the pain he was causing, was different. It wasn't just about the insults. It was the challenge, the attempt to force Frank to react, to prove himself. The young man wasn't finished. He stepped even closer, leaning in so that Frank could feel the heat of his breath. "You think you're special because you wore a uniform?" he sneered. "Newsflash, buddy, everyone's had a hard. You're no different." The rest of the group chuckled, egging him on, but the laughter was thinner now, less certain. Frank felt the familiar pulse of anger rise in his chest, but he swallowed it down. The young man's words were nothing more than an attempt to provoke him, to draw him into a fight, and Frank knew better than to fall for it. The coffee cup in his hand trembled slightly, but it was the only sign that he was even affected. The man noticed the slightest shift, the subtle tension in Frank's posture, and his grin widened. "Oh, I see it now," he mocked, stepping back to take it all in. "You're just a scared little man, hiding behind that chair, hoping no one notices what you really are." But Frank didn't flinch. Instead, he lowered his coffee cup, his eyes never leaving the young man's. He didn't need to respond. His silence was his answer, and the weight of it was heavier than any insult could ever be. The door to the coffee shop opened with a soft chime, unnoticed by most. But to Frank, the change in the atmosphere was immediate. It wasn't just the shift in the air or the subtle hush that seemed to ripple through the room. It was something deeper. It was the kind of presence that demanded attention without asking for it. Frank's gaze briefly flickered toward the entrance, his eyes catching sight of the man stepping inside. Sylvester Stallone. Frank's heart gave an almost imperceptible skip, but he quickly masked it, focusing once again on the young man in front of him. Still, there was no denying the shift in the room as Stallone's unmistakable figure made its way to the counter. The young man at Frank's table didn't notice at first, too caught up in his own performance. But others in the shop did. Whispers began to spread, and eyes shifted from the taunting scene to the new arrival. The man who had become a symbol of toughness and resilience. The actor whose name had been tied to action and courage for decades, now stood just a few feet away. Stallone, dressed casually in a black leather jacket and a dark shirt, stood with a quiet confidence. His presence was effortlessly commanding, not loud or showy, but unmistakable. He ordered his coffee with a quiet, "Thanks," his voice carrying a weight that made the barista's hand hesitate just a moment longer before she passed him his cup. He didn't look around, didn't seek attention. Instead, he moved toward the far corner of the room, sitting down with his back to the wall. His eyes briefly met Frank's, just for a second, but it was enough. There was something unspoken between them, an acknowledgement that didn't need words. The young man's voice faltered for just a moment as he noticed the shift in the room. The group of friends behind him seemed to quiet down, their attention now divided between the fight they were trying to start and the man who had entered the coffee shop like a force of nature. But it was the young man's next words that would change everything. And Stallone, now settled in his corner, was watching. The young man's bravado wavered for the briefest moment as he turned to face the newcomer, his eyes narrowing in recognition. The sudden realization that Sylvester Stallone was now in the coffee shop caused a shift in the energy. What had once been a noisy, taunting atmosphere began to settle, the edge of the mockery blunting, though the young man's pride was still firmly intact. Stallone, however, remained unbothered. He didn't make a spectacle of his entrance, didn't look for acknowledgement or approval. He sat in the corner, his eyes scanning the room in a way that felt like he was taking in every detail without anyone noticing. The faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, but it wasn't for the crowd or the situation. It was for Frank. The young man, still standing over Frank, must have noticed the change, the subtle shift in the atmosphere that followed Stallone's arrival. The room had gone from uncomfortable to electric. People were watching, holding their breath, wondering how this would unfold. And though the young man's eyes were still filled with bravado, there was a flicker of doubt in them now. That's when it happened. As Frank took a breath, preparing for the next insult, his gaze flicked towards Stallone. In that instant, their eyes met. It wasn't a look of hero worship or awe. It wasn't the kind of recognition you'd expect from someone who'd grown up idolizing action heroes. No, it was something more. It was the kind of glance that spoke volumes without a single word being exchanged. Stallone's steady gaze held Frank's for just a moment, the understanding clear between them. There was no judgment in his eyes, just recognition, respect. The young man, still oblivious to the silent exchange, continued his taunting. But now, he was no longer the center of attention. The room had shifted, and with one simple glance, Stallone had changed the entire dynamic. The noise, the mockery, the tension, they all seemed to quiet in the face of this unspoken bond. The taunts, which had felt sharp and cutting moments ago, now felt insignificant. The young man's bravado was already starting to crumble, though he didn't know it yet. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The young man's voice, still full of bravado, was suddenly a distant hum, barely reaching Frank's ears. The bustling coffee shop, once filled with the sounds of idle chatter and clinking mugs, seemed muted. It was as though the world had drawn in a collective breath, holding its weight, waiting for something. Frank's gaze remained fixed on Stallone for a moment longer, his heart slowing. The clarity that washed over him was unexpected, a feeling that he had long since forgotten. In that brief exchange of looks, he realized something he had been too stubborn to admit. He wasn't alone in this. He didn't need to fight this battle by himself. It wasn't about the young man or the insults anymore. The mocking words had been sharp, but they were hollow. They lacked meaning. The fight, if there ever truly was one, wasn't his to engage in. It wasn't about proving his worth or showing strength through confrontation. The clarity came in the form of understanding. Strength wasn't measured by the loudness of your response or how aggressively you could push back. It wasn't about putting on a performance or proving something to others. Strength was about how you stood in the face of adversity, how you held your ground without letting the world sway you. It was about the quiet resolve to remain true to yourself, regardless of the noise around you. Frank slowly exhaled, the tension in his shoulders beginning to release. The air felt lighter now, the weight of the situation no longer pressing against him. It was a simple realization, one that had eluded him for so long. The young man's taunts had no power over him, not anymore. And with that, the anger that had been simmering inside him for so long began to fade, replaced by something more profound. As the young man continued his rant, Frank finally turned his attention back to him. He didn't need to say anything. His calm, unwavering presence was enough. The battle had already been won. The young man, sensing that his words weren't having the desired impact, grew more erratic. His chest puffed out, his voice rising again. "You've got nothing to say, huh? That's what I thought. Just sitting there like you're some kind of statue. It's pathetic." Frank's hand, still wrapped around the coffee cup, was steady as ever. But something inside him shifted, something he hadn't felt in a long time. A spark, a quiet surge of resolve. The young man's voice became just noise, something unimportant, and Frank finally realized it wasn't just about the insults. It was about regaining his sense of control, about standing up not for pride, but for his own peace. The room seemed to hold its breath again. People were watching now, fully aware that something was about to happen. The young man, growing desperate for some kind of reaction, stepped closer, his face twisted in anger. Frank's eyes met his, calm but firm, as if he were seeing the boy for the first time. The moment hung in the air, pregnant with tension, but it was Frank who made the first move. He slowly set down his coffee cup on the table, the clink of the ceramic barely audible in the stillness. The small, deliberate action drew the eyes of everyone in the shop. Frank's gaze never left the young man's face as he pushed his chair back, the soft scrape of wood against the floor sounding louder than it was. It wasn't a sudden surge of anger or a grand display of strength. It was controlled, purposeful. Frank stood up slowly, every movement measured, like a man who had learned the art of patience. The young man took a step back, momentarily caught off guard by Frank's quiet shift. The crowd, still unsure of what would happen next, seemed to lean in. Frank didn't speak. There was nothing to say. His posture was open, calm, but there was an undeniable presence in the way he carried himself. He was not intimidated, not swayed by the young man's taunts. For the first time, the younger man's bravado faltered. Frank had made his move, not with words or violence, but with the simple act of standing tall, silent but resolute. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone. The power had shifted. The air in the coffee shop grew thicker with every passing second, the tension palpable, like the hum before a storm. Frank stood in the center of it all, his posture steady, his eyes never leaving the young man in front of him. The young man, who had been so full of energy and aggression, suddenly seemed smaller, unsure of how to proceed. His chest heaved with each breath, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, but his eyes flickered with doubt. The room was quiet now, save for the faint murmurs from the few remaining onlookers, who were waiting for something to happen. Everyone could feel it. The energy had shifted. The crowd's attention had moved from the young man's antics to Frank. He had become the center of gravity in the room, and the weight of that realization began to settle in. The young man, desperate to regain control, took a step forward. "You think just standing there makes you tough?" He spat, his voice rising again, this time with a hint of desperation. "You think I care about your silence? You're nothing but a has-been." But Frank didn't flinch. He didn't react. His gaze remained fixed, unwavering, as calm as the still water of a lake. Every word that came from the young man's mouth was like a wave crashing against the calm of his composure, but Frank held firm. The young man stepped closer, trying to force some reaction, trying to make Frank blink, to make him feel the sting of his insults. but Frank stood like a mountain, unmovable. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the laughter from the young man's friends had died down, unsure whether they should continue to cheer or not. The mockery that had once flowed so freely now hung in the air, awkward and brittle. Frank didn't need to say anything. His silence was louder than any insult could ever be. It was a quiet strength, one that made the young man's bravado seem shallow, almost laughable. The tension in the room reached its peak, the crowd's anticipation thick as the air itself, waiting for the next move. The young man's bravado was crumbling, and Frank knew it. The battle had shifted. The young man's patience snapped like a taut wire. His fists clenched tighter, his jaw set with a stubborn defiance. For a moment, he looked around at his friends, who were now standing on edge, unsure of how to react. The laughter that had once filled the air had been replaced with an uncomfortable silence. But the young man, unwilling to lose face in front of his friends, squared his shoulders and turned back to Frank. "You really think you're something special just because you've been through a few hard things?" He sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I've seen you type before. Tough guy routine. You sit there all quiet, pretending to be above it all. But I'm not impressed." He took a step forward, now just inches from Frank. Frank's eyes remained steady, locked onto the young man's. There was no fear in them, no anger, just a calm presence that seemed to grow with every second. The young man's words, though harsh, didn't even cause a flicker of reaction in Frank. And that was enough. The young man's voice grew louder, more desperate. "You think you're tough because you fought in some war? Well, you're in my world now. And here, there's no room for old men like you." His chest swelled as he puffed himself up, feeding off the energy of the room, determined to be the center of attention once again. He pointed a finger directly at Frank. "Come on, then. You think you got what it takes? You want to prove you're still relevant? Step up." For the first time, the young man's taunting seemed to hit its mark. He had issued a challenge, daring Frank to take the bait. The crowd was watching intently, breaths held, waiting for Frank's response. But Frank didn't move. His silence was the answer. The young man's confidence faltered just for a moment, but it was enough. He had thrown down the gauntlet, but in doing so, he had revealed his own insecurity. And in the quiet, steady presence of Frank, he had already lost. The challenge had been made, but Frank's response had already defeated it. The young man's words hung in the air, daring Frank to respond, to rise to the challenge. The crowd waited, their collective breath held, their eyes fixed on Frank, anticipating something. Anything. The tension was thick, the unspoken challenge hanging like a weight between them. Everyone expected Frank to either snap or rise to the bait, to finally fight back. But Frank didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his gaze unwavering as he met the young man's challenge with the same calm that had defined him throughout the entire confrontation. The young man, standing so close now, was practically daring him to make a move, his chest heaving with a mix of anger and pride. And yet Frank remained quiet. His hands, still at his sides, didn't twitch. His eyes, sharp and steady, didn't waver. For a moment, the young man's expression faltered, confusion creeping into his features. He had expected more, perhaps a fight, or at least a response, some acknowledgement that his taunts had struck a nerve. Instead, Frank's silence filled the space between them, and in that silence, there was an undeniable strength. Frank's refusal wasn't just about avoiding the fight. It was about showing the young man that he didn't need to prove anything. The fight, the noise, the bravado, it meant nothing. What mattered was how you held yourself, how you stood in the face of it all without needing to engage in the theatrics. The young man's smirk faded slightly as he realized the true weight of Frank's stance. There was no anger, no challenge, just quiet strength. Frank had shown him, without words or violence, that real power didn't need to be broadcast. The young man's shoulders slumped, the tension in his body melting away. The crowd, sensing the shift, began to relax. Frank had won, not through force, but through the sheer refusal to engage in the theatrics that the young man had so desperately sought. In the end, it wasn't the challenge that mattered. It was the way Frank chose to respond. And in his respectful refusal, He had already demonstrated the kind of strength that needed no words. The silence that followed Frank's refusal was thick, almost suffocating. For a moment, the entire coffee shop seemed frozen in time, the weight of his quiet response hanging heavily in the air. The young man, still standing with his chest puffed out, looked as though he had been robbed of his audience. The energy he had worked so hard to build, shouting, taunting, challenging, had dissipated in an instant. The room, once charged with tension, was now filled only with the sound of muffled breaths and hesitant glances. Then, slowly, a shift began. The people who had been watching from the edges, the ones who had been caught up in the noise of the confrontation, started to look at each other. The looks weren't of shock or fear, but of something else, something like understanding. The young man's bravado, which had seemed so powerful moments ago, now felt hollow. And in the midst of that, Frank stood as a quiet anchor, unmoving, unshaken. The first person to speak was the barista who had been watching the entire scene unfold from behind the counter. She was the kind of person who had seen her fair share of drama, but there was something different in the way she now looked at Frank. She gave him a small, respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of the strength it had taken to remain silent in the face of provocation. One by one, the patrons in the coffee shop began to shift, the unease that had settled over them breaking into murmurs of quiet support. Some exchanged glances, as if to say he's right. The young man's words had lost their bite. In their place was a collective understanding. Sometimes, the best way to stand tall wasn't to fight back, but to refuse to engage in the petty cruelty of it all. The young man, realizing that he had lost his audience, took a step back, the defiance in his posture slowly fading. There were no cheers, no applause. No one needed to say anything. The crowd's reaction spoke volumes, an unspoken respect for the man who had stood his ground without a single word. The energy in the coffee shop shifted again, but this time it was different. The quiet understanding that had begun to spread throughout the room was suddenly interrupted by a low, steady voice. Enough. The words came from the corner where Sylvester Stallone had been sitting, watching with a calm intensity. Frank hadn't noticed at first, but now, as the room collectively turned toward the source of the interruption, it was impossible to ignore. Stallone had risen from his seat, his movements smooth and deliberate, as if he had been waiting for this very moment. His presence, quiet but unmistakable, filled the room. The young man, still standing before Frank, stiffened at the sound of the voice. His smirk faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. It was one thing to face Frank's calm resolve, but this was something else. Sylvester Stallone was no mere observer. Stallone stepped forward, his gaze locked onto the young man. There was no need for theatrics, no dramatic pause. His eyes were steady, unwavering, and the authority in his presence was palpable. "This ends now," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience and the silent strength of someone who had lived through far more than the young man could possibly understand. For a long moment, the young man simply stared at Stallone, a look of disbelief crossing his face. The bravado that had once been so strong now seemed like a flimsy mask, and it cracked just slightly in front of Stallone's gaze. The crowd watched in stunned silence, not sure whether to cheer or hold their breath. Then, with a movement that spoke volumes, Stallone put a hand on the young man's shoulder, a gesture so simple yet so powerful. "You don't need to prove anything by putting others down. The real strength comes from knowing when to walk away, when to let go," he said, his voice quieter now, as if speaking from a place of hard-earned wisdom. The young man swallowed, his posture slumping just slightly. The challenge that had once been his to control now felt small, insignificant, in the face of Stallone's calm intervention. And in that moment, the room understood what had happened. The real battle had never been about words or fists, but about understanding the strength of knowing when to step back. The energy in the coffee shop shifted again, but this time it was different. The quiet understanding that had begun to spread throughout the room was suddenly interrupted by a low, steady voice. "Enough." The words came from the corner where Sylvester Stallone had been sitting, watching with a calm intensity. Frank hadn't noticed at first, but now, as the room collectively turned toward the source of the interruption, it was impossible to ignore. Stallone had risen from his seat, his movements smooth and deliberate, as if he had been waiting for this very moment. His presence, quiet but unmistakable, filled the room. The young man, still standing before Frank, stiffened at the sound of the voice. His smirk faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. It was one thing to face Frank's calm resolve, but this was something else. Sylvester Stallone was no mere observer. Stallone stepped forward, his gaze locked onto the young man. There was no need for theatrics, no dramatic pause. His eyes were steady, unwavering, and the authority in his presence was palpable. "This ends now," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience and the silent strength of someone who had lived through far more than the young man could possibly understand. For a long moment, the young man simply stared at Stallone, a look of disbelief crossing his face. The bravado that had once been so strong now seemed like a flimsy mask, and it cracked just slightly in front of Stallone's gaze. The crowd watched in stunned silence, not sure whether to cheer or hold their breath. Then, with a movement that spoke volumes, Stallone put a hand on the young man's shoulder, a gesture so simple yet so powerful. "You don't need to prove anything by putting others down. The real strength comes from knowing when to walk away, when to let go," he said, his voice quieter now, as if speaking from a place of hard-earned wisdom. The young man swallowed, his posture slumping just slightly. The challenge that had once been his to control now felt small, insignificant, in the face of Stallone's calm intervention. And in that moment, the room understood what had happened. The real battle had never been about words or fists, but about understanding the strength of knowing when to step back. The young man lay on the floor for a moment, disoriented, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. He slowly pushed himself up, wiping the sweat from his forehead, his face flushed with both embarrassment and fury. His pride had taken a hit, and it burned deeper than anything Frank or Stallone could have said to him. The room was deathly quiet, the silence now thick with anticipation, as if everyone was waiting for something more. The young man's friends, who had been cheering him on just moments before, now stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The once loud bravado had vanished, replaced with an awkward stillness. Frank took a step back, letting the young man gather himself, his eyes still steady, unfazed. He said nothing, not out of malice, but because he knew that words weren't necessary anymore. Stallone, who had remained an almost silent observer until now, took a slow step forward. His voice, when it came, was calm but firm, a contrast to the young man's earlier shouting. "It's not about winning or losing," he began, his tone carrying the weight of experience. "It's about honor, respecting others, respecting yourself. You don't earn that by trying to tear people down, especially people who've already fought their battles." The young man opened his mouth, likely to defend himself, but something in Stallone's gaze silenced him. It wasn't anger, just a quiet authority that spoke volumes. The young man